Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Chapter 10, War with Austria, 1809.
Before Napoleon returned to Paris from Spain, he learned that, yielding to England's instigations, Austria was about to take advantage of his being so far away, to cross its borders, invade Bavaria, carry the war to the banks of the Rhine, and then effect the liberation of Germany. The opportunity was an excellent one for attempting such an undertaking. The emperor had been compelled to send the pick of his battalions to the other side of the Pyrenees, thus greatly reducing the number of French foes in Germany. The French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Talleyrand, had during Napoleon's absence made every effort to conciliate the Emperor Francis, but the warlike preparations throughout the Austrian dominions proceeded with increasing vigor. After the declaration of war by Austria on the 6th of April, couriers were at once dispatched with orders to the armies on the Rhine and beyond the Alps to concentrate themselves on the field. To the ambassadors at Paris, the emperor spoke most freely of the coming conquest. "They have forgotten the lessons of experience there," he said. "They want fresh ones. They shall have them, and this time they shall be terrible, I promise you. I do not desire war. I have no interest in it, and all Europe is witness that my whole attention and all my efforts were directed towards the field of battle which England had selected. That is to say, Spain. Austria, which saved the English in 1805 when I was about to cross the Straits of Calais, has saved them once more by stopping me when I was about to pursue them to Corunna. She shall pay dearly for this new diversion in their favor. Either she shall disarm instantly, or she shall have to sustain a war of destruction. If she disarms in such a manner as to leave no doubt on my mind as to her further intentions, I will myself sheath my sword, for I have no wish to draw it except in Spain against the English. Otherwise the conflict shall be immediate and decisive, and such that England shall for the future have no allies on the continent." The instant Napoleon ascertained that Bavaria was invaded by the Archduke Charles, he at once proceeded, without guards, without equipage, accompanied solely by the faithful Josephine, to Frankfort and thence to Strasbourg. Here he assumed command of the army on the 13th of April, and immediately formed the plan of his campaign. He found the two wings of his army, the one under Messina, the other under Davoust, at such a distance from the center that, had the Austrians seized the opportunity, the consequences might have been fatal to the French. On the 17th of April, while at Donauworth, Napoleon commanded Davoust and Messina to march simultaneously towards a position in front, and then pushed forward the center in person to the same point. The Archduke Louis, who commanded the Austrian divisions in advance, was thus hemmed in unexpectedly by three armies, moving at once from three different points. At Donauworth, Napoleon addressed his troops in a proclamation in which he said, "Soldiers, the territory of the Confederation has been violated. The Austrian general expects us to fly at the sight of his arms and to abandon our allies to him. I arrive with the rapidity of lightning. Soldiers, I was surrounded by you when the sovereign of Austria came to my camp in Moravia. You have heard him implore my clemency and swear an eternal friendship towards me. Victors, in 3 wars Austria has owed everything to your generosity. 3 times has she perjured herself. Our past successes are a safe guarantee of the victory which awaits us. Let us march, and at our aspect may the enemy acknowledge his conqueror." It should be remembered that at this time, while Napoleon was astonishing Europe by the rapidity of his movements and the display of the resources of his military and political genius, he had left an army in the peninsula, distributed over an immense space of territory, weakened by diseases, reduced by partial combats, and without receiving reinforcements from the interior of the empire. During the whole of the German campaign of 1809, the French in Spain were merely able to maintain themselves in the positions they had occupied soon after Napoleon's departure. Austria had reckoned on the absence of Napoleon and his guard, and on the veteran troops of Marengo and Austerlitz being far distant. She knew that there did not remain more than 80,000 French scattered throughout Germany, while her army, divided into 9 bodies under the orders of the Archduke Charles, had not less than 500,000 men. The Archduke Louis was defeated and driven back at Abensberg on the 20th and utterly routed at Landshut on the 21st, losing 9,000 men, 30 guns, and all his stores. Those unfortunate Austrians who had been led from Vienna singing songs, under a persuasion that there was no longer a French army in Germany and that they should only have to deal with Württembergers and Bavarians, experienced the greatest terror when they came to conflict and found themselves defeated. The Prince of Liechtenstein and General Lusignan were wounded, while the loss of the Austrians in colonels and officers of lower rank was considerable. In the Battle of Abensberg, which occurred on the 20th, Napoleon was resolved to destroy the corps of the Archduke Louis and of General Keller, amounting to 60,000 men. The enemy only stood his ground for an hour and left 18,000 prisoners. The cannonade of the French was successful at all points, and the Austrians, disconcerted by Napoleon's brilliant movements, beat a hasty retreat, leaving 8 standards and 12 pieces of cannon. The French loss was very small. Before this engagement, Napoleon saw defile before him on the plateau in front of Abensberg the Württemberg and Bavarian troops, allies of the French, who were going to put themselves in line and whom the pride of fighting under a general of his renown filled with enthusiasm. The emperor caused them to be drawn up and proceeded to harangue them, one after the other, the officers translating his words to the troops. He said that he was making them fight, not for himself, but for themselves, against the ambition of the House of Austria, which was enraged at not having them, as of yore, under its yoke, that this time he would soon restore them peace and forever, and with such an increase of power that for the future they should be able to defend themselves against the pretensions of their old dominators. His presence and words electrified his German allies, who were flattered to see him amongst them, he trusting entirely to their honor. For at that moment he had no other escort than some detachments of Bavarian cavalry. When Napoleon arrived that evening at Roterberg, he was intoxicated with joy. The engagement, which was of short duration, had cost the Austrians 7,000 or 8,000 men, and he saw his adversary driven back on the Yser at the very beginning of the campaign, and the Austrian soldiers disheartened, like the Prussians after Jena. The Battle of Landshut completed the defeat of the preceding evening. On this day, General Mouton, at the head of a column of grenadiers, rushed through the flames that were consuming one of the bridges of the Yser. "Forward, but reserve your fire," he shouted to the soldiers in a voice of thunder, and in a few moments he had penetrated into the town, which then became the seat of a sanguinary struggle, and which the Austrians were not long in abandoning. Next day, Napoleon executed a variety of maneuvers, considered as amongst the most admirable of his science, by means of which he brought his whole force, by different routes, at one and the same moment upon the position of the Archduke Charles, who was strongly posted at Eckmühl with 100,000 men. On both sides all was ready for a decisive action. Until 8 o'clock, a thick fog enveloped that rural scene, which was soon to be drenched with the blood of thousands of men. As soon as it cleared away, both sides prepared for action. Not a musket or a cannon shot was fired before noon, however. There was no need of a signal for battle, as the terrible contest began on both sides simultaneously about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Napoleon commanding and leading the charge, and accompanied by Lannes and Massena. One of the most beautiful sights war could produce now presented itself. 110,000 men were attacked on all points, turned to their left, and successively driven from all their positions, although not a half of the French troops were engaged. The battle was stern and lasted until twilight, ending with the utter defeat of the Archduke's army, and leaving Napoleon with 20,000 prisoners, 15 imperial standards, and a vast number of cannon in his hands, while the defeated and routed enemy fled back in confusion on the city of Ratisbon. The Austrian cavalry, strong and numerous, attempted to cover the retreat of the infantry, but was attacked by the French both on the right and left. The Archduke Charles was only indebted for his safety to the fleetness of his horse, when darkness at length compelled the victors to halt. While the French were galloping along the road in pursuit of the Austrians, Finding the plain to which they had retreated swampy, they endeavored to regain the road, and thus became mingled with the mass of victorious cavalry. A multitude of single combats then took place by the uncertain light of the moon, and nothing was heard but the clashing of sabers on their cuirasses, the shouts of the commandants, and the heavy tramp of horses. The French cuirassiers, wearing double cuirasses, which covered them all round, could more easily defend themselves than the Austrians, who, having only breastplates, fell in great numbers, mortally wounded by the thrusts dealt them from behind. Night put an end to a contest where there were scenes of carnage that had not been equaled in years. At the Battle of Abensberg, the emperor beat separately the two corps of the Archduke Louis and General Keller. At the Battle of Landshut, he took the center of their communications and the general depot of their magazines and artillery. And finally, at the Battle of Eckmühl, the corps of Hohenzollern, Rosenberg, and Liechtenstein were defeated. The Austrians, astonished by rapid movements beyond their calculation, were soon deprived of their sanguine hopes and precipitated from a delirium of presumption to a despondency bordering on despair. 2 days later, the Archduke made an attempt to rally his troops, and not only to hold Ratisbon, but to meet Napoleon. He was obliged to give up the place at the storming of the walls by the French, who drove the Austrians through the streets. All who resisted were slain. The enemy's commander fled precipitately into Bohemia, abandoning once more the capital of the Austrian Empire to the mercy of the conqueror. Napoleon was wounded in the foot during the storming of Ratisbon. He had approached the town amidst a fire of sharpshooters, kept up by the Austrians from the walls, and by the French from the edge of a ditch. Whilst he was looking through a telescope, he received a ball in the instep, and said, with the coolness of an old soldier, "I am hit." When the emperor received his wound, he was talking with Duroc. "This," said he to his marshal, "can only come from a Tyrolean. No other marksman could take an aim at such a distance. Those fellows are very clever." The wound might have been dangerous, for had it been higher up, the foot would have been shattered and amputation inevitable. The first surgeon of the guard, Dr. Larry, being near, took off his boot and prepared to dress the wound, which was not serious. At the news that the emperor was wounded, the troops crowded around him in great alarm. Officers and soldiers ran up from all sides. In a moment he was surrounded by thousands of men, in spite of the fire which the enemy's guns concentrated on the vast group. The emperor, wishing to withdraw his troops from this useless danger, and to calm the anxiety of the more distant corps, who were getting unsteady in their desire to come and see what was the matter, mounted his horse the instant his wound was dressed and rode down the front of the whole line amid loud cheers. Those around remonstrated with him for continually exposing his person, to which he replied, "What can I do? I must see how things are going on." It was at this extempore review, says General Marbot, held in presence of the enemy, that Napoleon first granted gratuities to private soldiers, appointing them Knights of the Empire and members, at the same time, of the Legion of Honor. The regimental commanders recommended, but the emperor also allowed soldiers who thought they had claims to come and represent them before him. He then decided upon them himself. An old grenadier who had made the campaigns of Italy and Egypt, not hearing his name called, came up and in a calm tone of voice asked for the cross. "But," said Napoleon, "what have you done to deserve it?" "It was I, sir, who, in the desert of Joppa, when it was so terribly hot, gave you a watermelon." "I thank you for it again," said the emperor, "but the gift of the fruit is hardly worth the cross of the Legion of Honor." Then the grenadier, who up till then had been as cool as ice, working himself up into a frenzy, shouted at the top of his voice, "Well, and don't you reckon 7 wounds received at the bridge of Arcola, at Lodi, at Castiglione, at the pyramids, at Acre, Austerlitz, Friedland, 11 campaigns in Italy, Egypt, Austria, Prussia, Poland?" But the emperor cut him short laughing, and mimicking his excited manner, cried, "There, there, how you work yourself up when you come to the essential point. That is where you ought to have begun. It is worth much more than your melon. I make you a Knight of the Empire, with a pension of 1,200 francs. Does that satisfy you? But, your Majesty, I prefer the cross. You have both one and the other, since I make you a knight." Well, I would rather have the cross, and the worthy grenadier could not be moved from that point. It took much explaining to make him understand that the title of Knight of the Empire carried with it the Legion of Honor. He was not appeased on this point until the emperor had fastened the decoration on his breast, and he seemed to think a great deal more of this than of his annuity of 1,200 francs. It was by familiarities of this kind that the emperor made the soldiers adore him, but as Marbot again well says, it was a means that was only available to a commander whom frequent victories had made illustrious. Any other general would have impaired his reputation by it. Napoleon now sent an aide-de-camp to Lens, urging him to expedite the taking of Ratisbon. This intrepid marshal had directed all his artillery against a projecting house which rose above the wall surrounding the town. The house was knocked down, and the ruins fell into the ditch. Still, there were 2 fortified positions to take. Ladders were procured and placed at the critical points by the grenadiers, but every time one of them appeared, he was instantly brought down by the well-aimed balls of the Austrian sharpshooters. After some men had been thus struck, the rest appeared to hang back. Thereupon Lannes advanced, covered with decorations, seized one of the ladders, and cried out, "You shall see that your marshal, for all he is a marshal, has not ceased to be a grenadier." 2 aides-de-camp sprang forward and snatched the ladder out of his hands, and the grenadiers followed them, took the ladders, and notwithstanding the continued fire of the sharpshooters, made the crossing in safety, followed by hundreds of others in an instant. The walls being scaled, the town was soon in the hands of the French, who rushed along the blazing streets, taking prisoners in all directions. Suddenly they were stopped with a cry of terror uttered by the Austrians. "Take care, we shall all be blown up," shouted an officer. There were some barrels of powder left in the street, which were in danger of being fired by the shots exchanged on either side. The belligerents stopped with one accord and joined hands in removing the barrels to a place of safety. The Austrians then withdrew and left the town to the French troops. After the taking of Ratisbon, Napoleon issued an address to his soldiers complimenting them highly on their valor. "You have justified my expectations," he said. "You have made up for numbers by your courage. You have gloriously marked the difference which exists between the soldiers of Caesar and the armies of Xerxes. In a few days we have triumphed in the 3 battles of Tann, Ebensburg, and Eckmühl, and the affairs of Peising, Landshut, and Ratisbon. 100 pieces of cannon, 50,000 prisoners, 3 equipages, 3,000 baggage wagons, all the funds of the regiments, are the results of the rapidity of your marches and of your courage. Before a month we shall be in Vienna. Thus, in 5 days, in spite of inferiority of numbers and of the unfavorable manner in which his lieutenants had distributed an inferior force, by the sole energy of his genius, did Napoleon triumph over the main force of his opponent. The emperor reviewed his army on the 24th, distributing rewards of all sorts with a lavish hand. Upon Davoust he bestowed the title of Duke of Eckmühl. On May 3rd, a body of 30,000 Austrians remaining from the army of Landshut fell back upon Ebersberg, where Massena engaged in a stubborn battle, General Claparède being obliged to defend himself for 3 hours with but 7,000 men against 30,000 Austrians. Reinforcements at last arrived, and the enemy retired in disorder upon the Enns, where they burned the bridge so as to protect their flight in the direction of Vienna. The battle cost the Austrians 12,000 men, of whom 7,500 were prisoners. The field of carnage was hideous, and the town of Ebersberg was so wrapped in flames that the wounded could not be withdrawn. To prevent the fire from reaching the bridge, it had been necessary to cut off the approach at either end, so that communication was interrupted for several hours between the troops who had crossed the river and those coming to their aid. Napoleon had galloped up on hearing the cannonade, and though inured to all the horrors of war, is said to have been greatly shocked at the sight he beheld. Passing before the ruins of the castle of Dürnstein, on an eminence beyond the Molk, and in the direction of Vienna, whither he was going, Napoleon said to Marshal Lannes, who was at his side, "Look, behold the prison of Richard Coeur de Lion. Like us, he went to Syria and Palestine. Coeur de Lion, my brave Lannes, was not braver than thou. He was more fortunate than I at St. Jean d'Acre. The Duke of Austria sold him to an emperor of Germany who had him imprisoned there. That was in the barbarous ages. How different to our own civilization. You have seen how I treat the Emperor of Austria, whom I could have taken prisoner. Ah, well, I shall treat him again in the same manner. It is not my wish, but that of the age. From Molk, the headquarters of the emperor were transferred to St. Polten, and 2 days later, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Napoleon was at Vienna, which he desired to take forthwith, but to take without destroying if possible. Meeting with resistance in entering the city, the inhabitants having prepared for a vigorous defense, Napoleon began to play with his heavy batteries upon the city. The bombardment soon convinced them that it was hopeless to resist, and Vienna surrendered May 12th, after suffering severely. In a few hours, 1,800 shells had fallen in the city. The streets were narrow, the houses high, and the population crowded within the narrow fortifications, were terrified and infuriated at the sight of the damage caused by the shells which started fires in every direction. Who would have said to the Viennese, who were then hurling all manner of imprecations at Napoleon, the author of all their woes, that 10 months later they would be singing the praise of this detested emperor and would be voluntarily setting French flags in their windows as symbols of friendship? All the royal family had fled except the young Archduchess Marie-Louise, who was detained in the palace, suffering from smallpox. When Napoleon heard she was sequestered there, he ordered that no battery should be directed to that part of the town in which lay she, who was destined to be his bride, within less than a year. At this time, Napoleon himself would no doubt have laughed heartily had he been told that in that palace was a woman who was to succeed Josephine in his struggle for a dynasty, to be Empress of the French, and later to bear him the long-wished-for son and heir. That Marie had no such thoughts or inclinations can readily be guessed from the fact of the present campaign in which her father, the emperor, was battling for his empire. The Emperor Francis had left his capital on April 8, 1809, leaving there his wife and children, but all of whom departed except Marie on May 5th. From Vienna, Marie wrote frequently to her father. A rumor had reached the capital that the Battle of Eylau had been a brilliant victory for the Austrians, and the young Archduchess wrote to her father on April 25th. We have heard with delight that Napoleon was present at the great battle which the French lost. May he lose his head as well. There are a great many prophecies about his speedy end, and people say that the apocalypse applies to him. They maintain that he is going to die this year at Cologne, in an inn called the Red Crawfish. I do not attach much importance to these prophecies, but how glad should I be to see them come true. On May 13th, the capitulation of the Austrian capital was signed, and Napoleon's army again entered Vienna, the emperor taking up his old quarters at the imperial palace of Schönbrunn. He said to his soldiers, "The people of Vienna, according to the expression of the deputation, wearied, deserted, widowed, shall be the object of your regards. I take the inhabitants under my special protection. As for the turbulent and ill-disposed, I will make a severe example of them. Let us be kind towards the poor peasants, towards these good people, who have so many claims upon our esteem. Let us not be vain of all our successes, but look upon them as a proof of that divine justice which punishes ingratitude and perjury."
This concludes today's reading of the military career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Join us also next week for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.